So now that we've looked at World War I tanks and interwar tanks that need adding to War Thunder, it's now time to kick off our series looking at World War II tanks. And we're going to start off by looking at German World War II tanks. And as it turns out, there are still quite a few that need adding. So this is going to be quite a long episode, as I intend to look at as many German tanks as I can, hopefully looking at every variant but focusing on the most important tanks, as well as discussing their history and giving my thoughts on them where appropriate. And it will just be focusing on tanks for this episode, with tank destroyers, SPAA vehicles, armoured cars and other vehicles all being looked at in the future. So with all of that out of the way, let's get started with the episode. So starting off, pretty much every major tank type is represented in War Thunder, even if not every variant, so Panzer II, Panzer III, Panzer IV, etc, etc. But there is one major tank type that isn't represented in War Thunder, despite being used in large numbers in the early stages of the war, making up around 40% of German tanks involved in the invasion of Poland, 20% of those in the Battle of France, and even 12.3% of those used in Operation Barbarossa. I am of course talking about the Panzer I. Now, for those of you who have watched my episode on Spanish interwar tanks, you will know there is a very good reason Gaijin hasn't added the Panzer I, because this was armed with just two 7.92mm machine guns, which did have armour-piercing SMK bullets, but these could only penetrate just under 20mm of armour at 100 metres, so would be all but useless against most tanks in game. However, there was at least one variant that could potentially be added, this being the Panzer I-C or VK 6.01, which was designed by Kraus Maffei and was an attempt to improve the armament and speed of the Panzer I, with an eye for using it as a high-speed reconnaissance tank, or even in airborne operations. The first thing you might notice about this new variant is that it looks almost nothing like the old Panzer I, having a new superstructure and turret, and interleaved track wheels like on later German tanks. One of the big upgrades to the design is its armament, with the main weapon now being the EW-141, a 7.92mm semi-automatic gun that fired SMK-H armour-piercing rounds, at a high velocity of 1,170 metres a second, which gives this a penetration of 25mm at a 30-degree angle at 100 metres, which is the same as the 20mm Solothurn on the Schaber 39M in-game. A 7.92mm MG34 machine gun was also carried, which provides defence against soft-skin vehicles. The armour was also improved, with the frontal armour now coming in at 30mm and 20mm for the sides and rear, better than the armour of the already in-game Panzer II-C, so again this is a pretty decent upgrade. Moving on to mobility, again it was upgraded and is now theoretically capable of a top speed of 49 miles per hour, though in practice it was limited to a top speed of 40 miles per hour or 65 kilometers an hour. But this is still quite a bit faster than the Panzer II-C and F, so again mobility-wise it has an advantage over those tanks. Unfortunately it still only has 2 crew though, which does make it rather easy to knock out via crew losses. I could see this being added at 1.0, maybe 1.3 at a push, either in the German light tank line or the tank destroyer line, as it has excellent mobility paired with a decent armament and good armour, allowing for it to be used for capping points and flanking unaware enemies, and it would be cool to have at least one Panzer I variant to use in game. In real life, only around 40 of these tanks would be produced, with the first only entering service in 1943, 2 years after airborne operations had been cancelled after the invasion of Crete, where German paratrooper forces suffered massive losses. 2 of these did serve on the Eastern Front, but the majority were stationed in Normandy during the Allied invasion, and were subsequently lost, having not had much effect on the war. In theory, we could also get the Panzer I breeder, which you may remember from my video on Spanish interwar tanks, where basically a Panzer I was fitted with a 20mm breeder autocannon. But as this was done by the Spanish against the advice of German advisors like General von Thoma, I personally think it should be added as a Spanish tank. I would also argue against adding the Panzer I-F, which was a regular Panzer I with machine guns, but had a whopping 80mm of frontal armour, reducing to 50mm and 20mm in other areas. Needless to say, this would be virtually impossible to balance in game. Moving on to the Panzer II, there are a few variants of this tank that still need adding to War Thunder, like some of the early pre-production models like the A1, A2, A3, B and C, all uncapitalised unlike the later production models, and these were used to test various minor design features. For example, the A1 through A3 had 13mm maximum armour, the A1 had a shorter hull that was lengthened in the A2 and A3, and the A3 had a different cooling system to the A1. The B then had slightly increased armour at 14.5mm thick, wider tracks, and finally the C had a suspension system like that of the later Panzer IIs and introduced a more powerful 140 horsepower engine compared to the 130 horsepower engine of the previous pre-production models. But all of these had a 20mm autocannon, 7.92mm coaxial machine gun, top speed of 25 miles per hour, 40 kilometers an hour, and a 3-man crew, making them rather comparable to the in-game Panzer II, so perhaps they could be added at some point in the future. This then brings us to the production models, the capital A, B, D and E, but also a lot of later models that are better than the current top tier Panzer II-F. For the A and B variants, these are basically the same as the Panzer II-C, so it's completely understandable why they haven't been added. The D and E, on the other hand, do have improvements, but the D and E are basically the same tank themselves, it's just that the E uses lubricated tracks, but both variants now use a torsion bar suspension system and larger road wheels, allowing for a faster top speed of 34 miles per hour or 55 kilometers an hour, so 7 miles per hour faster than the in-game Panzer IIs, and they have 30mm of frontal armour. In-game we only really need one of these tanks, either the D or the E, and I could see them being added at the same battle rating as the Panzer II-F, so 1.7. And while I don't think there'll be a groundbreaking change to the German tech tree, I think they will do decently enough, especially with their added speed. But with the early models out of the way, we can now look at the Panzer II-G or VK901, which began development in June 1938 with the intention of creating a high-speed replacement of the Panzer II. In theory, this seems to have been achieved, as it now has a top speed of 40 miles per hour or 65 kilometers an hour, so 13 miles per hour faster than the Panzer II-F, and 6 miles per hour faster than the Panzer IV-D, while also having an interleaved wheel system, which allowed the tank to have greater manoeuvrability when steering. Unfortunately, the armour and armament haven't been improved, with the frontal and side armour remaining at 30mm and 15mm respectively, and the armament still consists of a 20mm KWK-38, though fitted with a vertical stabiliser, as well as one 7.92mm coaxial machine gun, while the crew remains at 3. I could see this being added at 1.7, maybe 2.0, as this is a much faster tank than the Panzer II-F, while still retaining the same armament, meaning it could function well as a scout vehicle and still have a chance of knocking out enemy tanks, especially with the top tier HVAP rounds, and it would make for a good scout. In real life, despite development work beginning in 1938, and despite being seen as a potential successor to contemporary Panzer IIs, delays and changes meant that production didn't begin until the end of 1941, by which point the Panzer II-F had been introduced and other similar projects were well underway. Thus only 45 would be built, though the tank's service history is a bit of a mystery, but it seems some of them were used in anti-partisan operations behind the front lines until at least 1944, while surplus turrets were used as fortifications on the Atlantic Wall and elsewhere. Meanwhile, 2 of the chassis were also used as the basis for the Panzerwaffe 1C, which is already in-game as a premium vehicle. The Panzer II-G would be followed by the Panzer II-H, or VK903, which is essentially the same tank but with the side armour increased to 20mm and fitted with a new more powerful 200 horsepower engine, which sounds really good, but due to the extra weight, this only allows it to maintain the same top speed as the Panzer II-G. This time only one prototype was produced, with various problems arising before the project was ultimately cancelled in March 1942, with both the Panzer II-G and H not really providing much of an upgrade compared to the already in service Panzer II-F, but I could still see this tank being added in game, even if only as a premium or event tank. However, there would be at least one more attempt at improving the Panzer II, which brings us to the far more famous Panzer II-L or VK1303, better known as the Luchs. Development began in 1939, so at the same time that the G and H were in development, which again begs the question why 3 very similar tanks were being worked on at the same time, and this used interleaving wheels along with the slack track system. The Luchs had a top speed of 37 miles per hour or 60 kilometers an hour, so very similar to the previous tanks, while having a maximum armour thickness of 30mm for the front and 20mm for the sides and rear. But the armament is still the KWK 38 20mm autocannon, along with one 7.92mm coaxial machine gun. Though the crew has now been increased to 4, which is a nice improvement, and makes this less vulnerable to crew losses. Again, I would suggest placing this at 1.7 to 2.0, and as a rather well-known tank, I could see a lot of people wanting to unlock it, and I could see this tank doing better than the Panzer II due to it being faster, and having slightly improved survivability due to the extra crew member. Only 100 of these tanks would be produced from September 1942 to January 1944, with these serving on the western and eastern fronts, but ultimately between the 3 Panzer IIs we've looked at, none of them even came close to replacing the existing Panzer IIs, which does beg the question why so many resources were put into developing barely improved tanks, and why they bothered to put them into production, only to hardly produce any of them at the end of it. I can also somewhat understand why Gaijin hasn't added all of these tanks, but I definitely think we should get the Luchs at some point, because like I say, it is a decent upgrade to the Panzer II, and it is a pretty well-known tank, so hopefully we'll get that one at some point in the future. It should be noted that there was technically an amphibious version of the Panzer II, the Panzer II Schwimmkörper, but this was only achieved by attaching 2 large pontoons, which would make this really unwieldy when operating on land, so I don't think this one could be added. But if there was ever a game mode with just amphibious tanks like for an April Fool's event, then in theory this variant could be added. And like with the Panzer I, there is a variant of the Panzer II I would argue against adding, which is the Panzer IIJ, for much the same reasons as the Panzer I, as this tank has 80mm of armour for the front and 50mm for the sides and rear, while still armed with the usual 20mm autocannon, again making this very hard to balance in game. So that's the Panzer II, but before we leave the light tanks, Skoda in occupied Czechoslovakia produced a rather interesting design that would be tested against the Luchs, the Panzerwaffe II or Skoda T-15, which was armed with a 37mm Skoda A-19 gun, and a top speed of 31 miles per hour or 50 kilometers an hour, 30mm of armour and a 4-man crew. And honestly, this could be quite a good light tank to have in the German tech tree in the lower tiers, and might represent a good alternative to the Panzer IIs. However, in those real-life tests, the Luchs won out, and thus only 4 T-15s were produced during the war, though one was also produced after the war, which means that it could be added as a Czechoslovakian tank if needed, and it would be nice to see this tank added somewhere in-game. Unfortunately, there aren't many other variants of Czechoslovakian tanks that are already in the German tree to be added. For example, the Panzer 35T was just taken over by the Germans, they never produced it, so they never made any extra variants. And while in theory we do need the Panzer 38T, B through E and the G variant, these don't really represent anything different to the Czech tanks that we already have in game, so they would be pretty low on the priority list to be added. However, it seems at least one Panzer 38T was tested as an amphibious tank much along the same lines as the Panzer II. Again, it looks a bit too unwieldy to use on land, so probably couldn't be added to the regular tech tree, but if there's ever an amphibious tank event, then this would be a good, easy variant to add for the German team. So moving on from the light tanks and on to the medium tanks, we start off with the Panzer III, and while we have most of the standard variants, there are still a few that need adding, though you can probably see quite quickly why Gaijin hasn't prioritised these vehicles. The first of these variants are the original Panzer IIIs, which were in many ways used as test beds for different systems and suspensions to be tested on, before being incorporated to future designs. And so the first of these we're going to look at is the Panzer IIIA, of which only 10 were built, and it is similar in many respects to the Panzer IIIB already in game, but has 5 large road wheels while the B only has 8 small road wheels. But both tanks are capable of the same top speed of 22 miles per hour or 35 kilometers an hour, and the Panzer IIIA could probably be added at battle rating 1.0, and could perhaps be the starting tank for the German medium tank line. But honestly, there's not a huge amount of difference between this and the B, so I suspect it will take a while to get this variant. The next standard models are the Panzer IIIC, with 15 examples built, and had a slightly redesigned suspension and new cupola, and then the Panzer IIID, which had 25 models built, and had a new transmission and redesigned engine compartment. These tanks could be added, but it is rather understandable why they haven't to this point, as they don't really differ from each other all that much. And like I say, while they still could be added, they probably should be somewhere near the bottom of the priority list for the time being. Skipping the E and F variants which are already in game, we then come to the Panzer III-G, which is armed with the 37mm gun, but now has 30mm of rear armour, compared to 20mm for the previous tanks, which isn't a huge difference but could improve survivability slightly, and I could see this working at battle rating 1.3 to 1.7. Lastly, for the standard variants, we come to the Panzer III-H, which is essentially the Panzer III-G, but with a 50mm gun as standard and a new 6-speed gearbox. Again, while it could still be added, it probably wouldn't be hugely different from the Panzer III-J, but it could be added at maybe 2.0 to 2.3, though again it should be a low priority. So that is the standard models that haven't been added, and it is somewhat understandable why they haven't been added. But there are still quite a few effective minor models that need adding to War Thunder, such as the Panzer III Waffe 0725, which is a one-off example of a Panzer III-L fitted with the Waffe 025 squeezebore gun. Now this is a very interesting weapon because, like I say, it is a squeezebore weapon, so it has two calibers listed, with the breech starting at 75mm, but the end of the barrel being 55mm. So how this basically works is that the projectile is the same size as the end of the barrel, but it is surrounded by a soft outer jacket, which is compressed as the projectile travels down the barrel, giving a much greater muzzle velocity and thus penetration, meaning it is capable of punching through 209mm of armour at 500 metres, or 171mm at a 30-degree angle, far superior to the length 60-50mm gun, which can only manage 83mm with its APC round at the same distance. And don't worry, I will talk about why this weapon wasn't adopted later in the video, because of course that is an insane performance from that gun. The rest of the tank stats are the same as the regular Panzer III-L, so it retains all of the advantages and disadvantages of that design. But with its hugely improved gun, it can now take on far tougher enemies, though post-penetration damage might be lacking. Nonetheless, I think this could be added in-game, probably as an event tank or maybe at a push on the regular tech tree, and I think it would work quite well as a mobile tank destroyer. To be honest, I can sort of understand why this hasn't been added already, as it does seem like it would be fairly hard to balance being a regular tank with a gun more powerful than the Panther and Tiger, but it is a very interesting tank that I would like to see in-game, and I would definitely try and unlock it if it was available in an event. Of course, during the war, many earlier Panzer IIIs with 37mm guns were rearmed with the short length 42 50mm gun as it became available, meaning we could have the Panzer III-E and that already in game with the enhanced armament. These were also sometimes given additional 30mm armoured plates, improving survivability, and perhaps these variants could be introduced to the German tech tree, possibly at battle rating 2.0, helping to bridge the gap between the Panzer III-F and J. Lastly, for the Panzer III, we have a number of Panzer III-Gs, which were designated the VW40, that were used to test a new suspension with interleaved wheels, potentially resulting in a ride that is a bit smoother and maybe allowing for more accurate shooting on the move, but I haven't been able to find results from this conversion. Ultimately, one of these was tested from the 8th to the 14th of November 1942, alongside the MAN and Daimler-Benz Panther prototypes, but there is no mention on how it performed other than it and some other vehicles, quote, fell out, unquote, towards the end. Ultimately, no more Panzer IIIs would be fitted with the system beyond those already converted, so presumably it wasn't considered good enough to convert any further tanks. That said, it could still work in War Thunder, and while not groundbreaking, I could see it being a useful tank for getting around the battlefield. Moving on, we now come to the Panzer IV, the most numerous of German tanks in World War II, and we have a few standard variants and unique experimental models that still need adding. But before looking at them, I'm going to discuss a modification that was installed on some Panzer IVDs, Es and F1s. This being the 4 Panzer armour upgrade, which added 20mm applique armour to the front of the hull and turrets of these tanks, giving good additional protection and making them far tougher to take down. While in theory it could be possible to add these as a modification for existing Panzer IVs, it would make these tanks much harder to balance and would necessitate a battle rating change. So I would suggest adding a separate variant of the Panzer IV F1 with this extra armour at 2.3 to 2.7, and it would probably act similar to the Sherman Jumbos, having very good frontal armour while restrained by the less effective gun. But I could see this being a welcome addition to the German tech tree, and would give us a good counterpart to the Panzer IIIJs in a lineup. So now moving on to the standard Panzer IV variants, the first of these is the Panzer IVA, which had less armour than later variants, only having 16mm of frontal armour and 14.5mm for the sides and rear, while the top speed was only 20 miles per hour or 32 km an hour on a 230 horsepower engine, a full 6 miles per hour slower than the Panzer IVC, while having the same armament and crew count as that tank. Obviously this could be considered a downgrade compared to the Panzer IVC, but this actually could work in game, because the Panzer IVC is a 1.3 tank, so in theory the Panzer IVA could be added at 1.0, and could even be added without its heat shells for balancing purposes, and I think it would do fairly well in the starting tiers as Germany's first Panzer IV variant. Moving on to the Panzer IVB, this isn't really that different to the Panzer IVC, as it has the same armour and the same top speed, so probably isn't worth adding for a very long time, but it could be folded with the Panzer IVC if needed. And then lastly, for common variants, we have the Panzer IV-D, which has slightly thicker armour from the C, with the mantlet now being 35mm versus 30mm, and the side armour is increased from 14.5mm to 20mm. However, the last 68 hulls of the Panzer IV-D had 50mm thick armour plates installed on the lower hull, as well as the 4 Panzer armour in some cases, while additional 20mm armour plates were installed on the sides of some of these tanks. Again, the early model is very similar to the Panzer IVC, but the later up-armoured variants could be added at 1.7 to 2.0. And while I suspect it wouldn't be a groundbreaking change to the German tech tree, it would still be an interesting vehicle to use nonetheless. So that is all of the standard Panzer IV variants, but there are some less common variants. For example, this Panzer IV-D, which has been fitted with the long 50mm gun from the Panzer III J1s, giving this tank a much more effective weapon than the previous short 75mm gun. And this basically came about when attempts were being made to upgun Germany's various tanks in the aftermath of Operation Barbarossa, where it was found that short 50mm and 75mm guns from the Panzer IIIs and IVs were not really up to the task of dealing with enemy tanks. At first it had been planned to fit the length 42 50mm gun on a Panzer IV for testing, but in 1941 Krupp received a request to instead test the longer length 60 gun, which was fitted to a Panzer IV-D and presented to Hitler on his birthday on the 20th of April 1942, which was funnily enough the same day he got to view the Tiger tank for the first time, which I suspect he was much more impressed by. The new gun would have an in-game penetration of 64mm at a 30-degree angle at 500 metres with its stock APC shell, versus 37mm for the short 75mm gun's APC-BC shell. And although the Panzer IV's top-tier heat shell can penetrate a maximum of 100mm, this is with a velocity of 450 metres a second versus 835 metres a second for the 50mm gun, which would make aiming the 75mm gun much harder. The rest of the tank has the same stats as the Panzer IV-D, and I could see this being a cool event vehicle, or if it was added to the tech tree, it would probably be somewhere between the Panzer IV F1 and F2 at battle rating 2.7, giving players a good intermediate tank between the Panzer IV F1 and F2, and helping to fill in the gap between those two tanks. In real life, it was ultimately decided not to fit the length 60 50mm gun to any more Panzer IVs, as ultimately the tank was capable of receiving much larger weapons like the 75mm KWK-40, length 43 and length 48 guns, which were both much more effective weapons, and even if the 50mm gun had been installed for some reason, it's likely it would have had to be replaced within a few years anyway, as more effective tanks were fielded by the Allies. The long 75mm gun was also sometimes retrofitted to older Panzer IV models like the D, giving them a great boost in firepower, though retaining their lower armour thicknesses to later tanks. And these upgunned Panzer IVs could be represented in game as well, perhaps at around battle rating 3.0 to 3.3, to offset their increased vulnerability. Lastly, for the Panzer IV, we have this rather odd looking design, the Panzer IV Hydrostatischen Antrieb, or hydrostatic drive, which is basically a Panzer IV-G fitted with a hydrostatic drive at the rear of the tank, which I believe is somewhat similar to the electric drive from the Porsche Tiger, but using a petrol hydraulic system instead, with 2 oil pumps powering 2 hydraulic motors, while a hydraulic turret was fitted towards the end of testing. I believe the advantages to this system is having a faster acceleration, a reverse speed the same as its forward speed, better manoeuvrability, and the hydraulic turret might traverse faster. But unfortunately the test data for this tank was lost, so it's hard to tell what the differences actually were in practice. The lack of test data might make adding this vehicle a bit problematic, but if it was added, it could potentially be placed at 3.3, the same battle rating as the regular Panzer IV, either as a folded tank or an event vehicle. And this very unusual tank might throw a few surprises for enemies if added to War Thunder. In real life, like I mentioned, the German test data was lost, so we don't have exact stats for it, but presumably it wasn't a great success as no more were built. But it was captured by the Americans at the end of World War II and still survives to this day, which is pretty cool. So moving away from the Panzer IV, we now come to the Panzer V or Panther, and pretty much all of the standard variants of the Panther have been added, but there are some minor variants, and of course it is sometimes forgotten that there was a competitor to the Panther tank that we have in game in the form of the VK3002DB, this being Daimler-Benz design for the new tank. Basically, the Panther had come about after encountering Soviet T-34s with long barrel guns, sloped armour and wider tracks. Now, these design concepts weren't foreign to German tank designers, but up to now they had felt there were too many disadvantages to adopt them for their own tank designs. For example, sloped armour can reduce the amount of available interior space, and longer barrels have a higher chance of getting caught on obstacles. This changed after encountering Soviet T-34s that were highly resistant to current German tank guns, despite actually having thinner armour than the Panzer III and IV, while carrying a gun that could easily penetrate German tanks and was far less likely to get bogged down in muddy conditions. Of course, in 1941 the Soviet T-34s didn't perform as well as they could have, due to various issues with training, doctrine, lack of supplies and spare parts, etc, and experienced German tankers were for the most part able to best them. But the advantages in their design features were made quite apparent. Thus, in October 1941, General Heinz Guderian invited a commission to come and inspect knocked out T-34s, which resulted in a requirement for current tanks to be upgunned and given access to wider tracks to help reduce ground pressure, and most importantly for us, for a new tank to be designed with much heavier armament and armour while maintaining a high mobility. There were some arguments against designing a new tank, but ultimately on the 25th of November 1941, a requirement for a new tank design was sent out to MAN and Daimler-Benz, and was to be ready by spring of 1942. MAN's VK3002M design was the design that was ultimately chosen, though its original frontal armour was 60mm, being increased to 80mm at the insistence of Hitler. And funnily enough, despite the 3002M's inclusion in War Thunder with the reduced armour, I don't think it was actually built before the armour change was brought in, which essentially makes this a paper design in game. Daimler-Benz design on the other hand heavily resembles the T-34, with its turret mounted at the front of the tank, compared to MAN's central turret design, while the hull had sloping armour all round like the T-34, with the front being 60mm sloped at 55 degrees, the sides above the track being 40mm sloped at 40 degrees, and the rear 50mm sloped at 25 degrees, while the turret was 80mm thick for the front and 45mm for the sides and rear. Interestingly, it was to use a rear-mounted transmission and diesel engine like the T-34, bearing in mind that German tanks didn't really use diesel engines, and the Germans had issues with rear transmissions going all the way back to the Leicht Traktor. Ultimately, this design had a top speed of 35 miles per hour or 56 kilometers an hour, so similar to MAN's design, but its narrower tracks meant it would have a much greater ground pressure compared to the MAN design. And lastly, a crew of 5 were to be carried, 2 in the hull and 3 in the turret. I could see this vehicle being added at 5.3, maybe 5.7 at a push, and I think it would be a very interesting tank to have in game, allowing players to try out a tank that, if history had gone just a little bit different, might have become the standard Panther tank used by the German army. In the end, the 3002DB would not be adopted, but originally Hitler had been in favour of the design, even going as far as to order 200 units. But ultimately, after a committee looked at the MAN and Daimler-Benz designs, they preferred the former for a number of reasons. Partly, the Daimler-Benz design looked too much like a T-34, which could cause friendly fire incidents. The use of a front-mounted turret caused more barrel overhang than needed, and MAN's design used an existing engine. However, a very large part for its rejection was down to the turret. You see, both designs were supposed to use a Rheinmetall designed turret, yet Daimler-Benz for some reason decided to design their own. And as it turns out, the hull wouldn't fit the Rheinmetall turret, meaning the hull would need to be redesigned, or production would have to be delayed until the new turret was ready, which would cause them to miss a December 1942 deadline to start production. That said, despite the rejection, a prototype would still be produced, though with some minor changes such as to the suspension, but in tests it got stuck in a ploughed field and had to be towed away, and then after only 2 kilometres of driving across a meadow, it suffered damage to the transmission, no doubt reinforcing German beliefs against rear transmissions, and thus it missed the rest of the trials. Ultimately, it did survive the war, but only a few poor quality photos of the battered remains in the bombed out Berlin Daimler-Benz plant remain of the tank. Of course, just because we have all of the major variants of the Panther doesn't mean there aren't a few lesser known variants. For example, there is at least one known variant of the Panzer D fitted with the turret of the Panzer IV-H. Obviously, this would be a bit of a downgrade with regards to armament and protection, using the less powerful 75mm KWK-40 in a less protected turret. But even worse is that the turret is unable to rotate, as this was intended as a command tank, and due to the different sized turret rings, it was simply bolted to the hull. That said, if the elevation still works, this could be turned into a sort of tank destroyer vehicle, and it could possibly fit in at battle rating 4.3, either on the tech tree or as an event vehicle, being a quite interesting tank with a very strong hull but a very vulnerable turret. So that is most of the Panther variants, but there is potentially one more that could at a push be implemented, that being the Panzer II. Now I should clear up some confusion, as you may remember the Panzer II was added to War Thunder and removed later on for being historically inaccurate. And that is because while it had the name of Panzer II, the actual design in game was basically a hodgepodge of real life designs that all existed, but were then mounted on a Panther tank in a way that was never done, and in many cases physically wouldn't work. For example, it had an 88mm gun that didn't actually fit in the turret. But there was a real Panzer II design that was under development in World War II, which could potentially be added. Essentially, this was an attempt to up-armour the Panther even more than it already was. Bearing in mind, discussions on this began in January 1943, when the original Panther was only just going into production, and half a year before its combat debut at the Battle of Kursk. For this new tank, the armour for the Glacis was to be increased from 80mm to 100mm, while the side armour was to be increased to 60mm, which was especially important as the current Panther was vulnerable even to anti-tank rifles at close range, and the roof armour was also increased to 30mm, giving better protection from aircraft. There was further talk of different engines being fitted, including a 900 horsepower Maybach HL234, as well as standardising parts with the Tiger II. But it doesn't seem like these talks got very far, as work on the prototype seems to have stopped by June 1943, in practice if not officially, as 5.5mm Scherzen side skirts now protected the Panther's flanks, killing much of the need for the project, while if the design had been adopted, production would have been significantly disrupted. Now this is where adding the Panther II becomes less simple, because while a chassis was produced, a turret wasn't, as it was intended to use a new turret that was never completed, while in the post-war period the US Army fitted a Panther G turret to it. An easy compromise would be to just add it in-game as it is now, with the Panther G turret, maybe at 6.3, where I think it would be a pretty good tank to have in-game. I can see why Gaijin hasn't added it though, because it would open up a whole lot of debate on adding half-completed tanks, but like I say, it would be a nice tank to see in War Thunder regardless. So now we come to the German heavy tanks, and there are a lot of them to cover, as these range from the late 1930s to the immediate predecessors of the Tiger tank. The first of these heavy tank projects is the Deutschboxwagen, I've probably butchered that pronunciation, or DW, with 2 prototype hulls being ordered from Henschel in January 1937, along with 1 turret. It's unclear if the turret was ever fitted, since the two very close-up photos from the second prototype that you are seeing on screen are literally the only photographic evidence of these tanks in existence. But if we know the turret's weight, it could potentially be added since it would be possible to work out how it would perform on the tank. The DW was protected by 50mm of armour all round the turret and hull, while even the whole roof and bottom of the tank would have had 20mm of armour, and the turret roof would have been 15mm thick, making this a pretty well protected tank for the time, though the prototypes were made from soft steel, and coming in at around 30 tons. Armament-wise is nothing spectacular, as it is literally the same short 75mm gun from the Panzer IV, which isn't a bad weapon by any means, but not suited to long-range engagements. Meanwhile, two 7.92mm machine guns were carried, one coaxially and one in the bow. Meanwhile, the speed and crew count is a bit more uncertain, though it was supposed to be capable of a top speed of 22 miles per hour or 35 kilometers an hour. And I suspect the crew count is 3, as it would seem 2 crew were in the hull, and I would be very surprised if it was decided to go with 2 crew in the turret, unless there was absolutely no choice. Though this did happen sometimes, for example the Panzer II and Czech tanks used by the Germans. I could see the DW being added at 2.3 to 2.7, as it has the same armour as the Panzer IV F2, but fitted with the shorter gun of the F1 while being slower. But it would be nice for the first German heavy tank design to be incorporated into War Thunder. In real life, the second prototype would be very similar to the first, but incorporating some automotive changes, and a third prototype would be ordered for firing tests to be carried out on. But work on the DW in its current form seems to have ended, instead serving as a basis for the VK3001H, of which 8 were ordered in January 1940. The VK3001H, the H standing for Henschel, was very similar to the DW design, having the same short 75mm gun, 50mm all-round armour, and same hull design. But it did have a new suspension and interleaving road wheels, and was able to reach a top speed of 22 miles per hour or 35 kilometers an hour, while having a crew of 5 and weighing 32 tons. Like with the DW, I could see this being a 2.3 tank, having very similar stats to it, and again it would be nice to have another German heavy tank for the earlier tiers. Ultimately, 4 VK3001Hs would be assembled, but this process would be dragged out, as by now Germany had invaded the Soviet Union, which had prompted a change in what was required for heavy tanks. At first it was requested to rearm the 3001s with various 50mm guns, longer 75mm guns and even squeeze-bore guns, but these never panned out due to the turret not being able to fit them without extensive modifications, and by January 1942 rearmament attempts were abandoned with none of the new weapons ever being fitted. Ultimately, efforts instead focused on new tanks, like the Tiger. Ironically, there is actually a picture of a 3001H being assembled by a Tiger tank in 1942, showing how quickly things had moved on, especially since the Tiger used components that were originally designed for the 3001. That said, some of the turrets would be repurposed as coastal fortifications, and 2 of the 3001 hulls would be used to construct 2 Stuart Emil tank destroyers. And this tank destroyer is already in game, and one of these survives to this day in the Kubinka Tank Museum. So, weirdly enough, this project does survive in some form. The VK3001H would be followed up by the VK3601H, which had a maximum armour thickness of 100mm for the whole front, 80mm for the turret front, and 80 to 60mm for the sides and rear, while having a top speed of 25 miles per hour or 40 kilometers an hour with a 5-man crew. It's the armament, however, which is especially interesting, as it was intended to use the Waffe 0725 squeeze-bore gun, which we covered earlier in the Panzer III section. And as a reminder, the barrel narrows towards the end of the gun, so you have a smaller projectile surrounded by a softer outer jacket, and as the projectile travels down the barrel, the jacket is squeezed, giving higher muzzle velocities. And again, just to remind you of the penetration, it can penetrate 209mm at 500 metres, or 171mm at a 30-degree angle. The Panther's main gun, for comparison, can only manage 173mm at a 0-degree angle at the same range, so nearly 40mm less. So this was a brilliant gun. Unfortunately, while very powerful, it required 1 kilogram of tungsten for each projectile, which was also needed for machine tools, and was extremely hard to get hold of, with Spain and Portugal being the main suppliers in Europe at the time, but their exports to Germany were restricted as the war went on, while the only other supplier was Japan, who was able to send very little tungsten via blockade runners. Suffice to say, no matter how good the gun was, it was never going to be adopted under those circumstances, so the 88mm KWK-36 would be chosen instead. And while the chassis itself would be adopted, it was quickly superseded by the VK4501H, which would become the Tiger tank. Turrets were built for the tank, however, but I'm unsure if they were ever fitted to the chassis, or if the 88mm or Waffe 0725 were ever tested on them. That said, if it could be added, this would be a very powerful tank indeed, perhaps being added at 5.7 if fitted with the 88mm gun, but potentially going much higher if fitted with the squeezebore gun. And it would be rather interesting to see this tank in game. So in real life, only a few chassis would be produced, while the turrets would be used as fortifications, and one of the chassis took part in trials against the MAN and Daimler-Benz Panther prototypes. But there were other heavy tank designs not made by Henschel. This brings us to the VK3001P, which was made by Porsche, which was to have 80mm of frontal armour for the turret, 75mm for the hull, and 60 to 40mm for the sides and rear, and had a top speed of 37 miles per hour or 60 km an hour, while using an electric transmission like the later VK4501P, which could be a great advantage, while a crew of 5 manned the gun. Armament is a little less clear, as it was supposed to be fitted with either a short 75mm gun like on the Panzer IV, or a 105mm length 28 gun, which was to be fitted in a Krupp turret which wasn't completed when the project was cancelled. It seems we would know roughly how it performs with the turret, as weights were used to simulate this in testing, but it also depends on whether the turret was ultimately finished. If added, I could see this being added at 3.3 or maybe a little higher, as it has pretty good all-round armour, but potentially lacklustre weaponry depending on what it is added with. Ultimately, 2 prototypes were built, and after the project was cancelled, they were used during the development of the VK4501P, which was a competitor against the 4501H, which would become the iconic Tiger tank. Speaking of the 4501H, or Tiger tank, as time was of the essence, it incorporated a lot of components from the previous 3001 and 3601 designs, which indeed sped up the development time, but did cause quite a few issues since the new Tiger tank now weighed a whopping 57 tonnes, compared to the 32 and 40 tonnes of the previous designs, for which their components had been designed. The Tiger tank itself, while having all of its standard variants in game, does still have a few less common variants that could potentially be added. For example, the initial Tiger tanks were originally intended to have an extra armour module, the 4 Panzer, which was a shield that could be hydraulically lowered to protect the tracks and lower hull from the front, giving even greater protection for the tank. I haven't found an exact thickness for the shield, though looking at the photo I suspect it to be around 30 to 40mm thick, which would protect the tracks from all machine gun and even some autocannon fire, making this tank much harder to immobilise from the front. However, after firing tests, the 4 Panzer was quickly dropped from production due to the added complexity and weight of the design. Not to mention, if the plate was hit and jammed or knocked off, it might impede the tank's movement or cause other issues. Thus, only the 1 prototype and test hull were ever equipped with it. That said, it would make for a good optional unlockable module, or even potentially a completely new tank at 5.7 to 6.0. And it would be interesting to see a Tiger tank fitted with even more protection than usual, and would give it a rather interesting look. I had hoped to cover another variant of the Tiger tank, the VK4501H2, which was the Tiger tank but armed with the 75mm gun from the Panther in a new Rheinmetall turret that also resembles the turret of the Panther, which would have been quite interesting as the Panther's gun is more powerful than the 88mm gun as fitted to the regular Tiger. And it was actually intended to switch production to the 75mm armed variant after the first 100 Tiger tanks had been produced. Unfortunately, sources are a little unclear how far they got, but it seems that a turret design was ready by the 11th of February 1942, while a meeting on the 14th of July 1942 resulted in the cancellation of plans to fit the turret. I suppose in theory the turret could have been made, but the only photos I have been able to find are of the wooden mock-up, and no sources definitively say it was actually built. That said, it would have been a rather cool variant of the Tiger tank to have in game, if development had just got a little bit further along before its cancellation. So that brings us to the end of this episode looking at German tanks that need adding to War Thunder, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on these tanks or any other tanks you think I should cover. This is likely going to be the longest video I've done for quite a while, and I'll be looking at the other German vehicles in other videos at some point in the future, along with videos looking at other nations' World War II tanks. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the video, hopefully you'll join me for the next one. I've been Toreno, and I'll see you next time.